Civilizations do not first collapse in fire or storm, but in silence. When a single unit tips astray, when a pound is mistaken for a kilogram, when a decimal is nudged from truth. NASA once lost a spacecraft to such a silence. Tonight, on the eve of a $1.2 billion port deal, a dockhand's child sees the same tilt, hidden not by chance but by choice, and knows that steel and water will not forgive a lie. The harbor woke before the sun. Sodium lights along the quay threw their pale crowns across the cranes, and the tide made that old, steady breath sound against the pylons. Isla Martinez walked with her father, holding his battered thermos in one hand and his lunch tin in the other. She was 12, slim and watchful, and she had learned the rhythms of this place as some children learn hymns. The long beeps of the trucks, the cough of an engine that should have retired a decade ago, the clank of steel on steel. Her father called these noises the harbor's heartbeat. "Hold the thermos straight, mija," he said, teasing. "You tilt it, I drink coffee flavored with salt." "You drink salt anyway," she said. His laugh came easy, worn soft from years of hard nights. They passed the stacked containers, red, blue, green, their paint worn by storms. A hook swung above them, pendulum-like. Isla counted the seconds between its arcs, her lips moving silently. She liked numbers that obeyed gravity. She liked numbers that told the truth. Far across the yard, the boardroom shone behind glass. Even at this hour, silhouettes moved against a glowing slide. Her father looked up, and his mouth tightened. "They are rehearsing the wedding," he said. "Big marriage, big dowry." "What are they marrying?" she asked. "Money to concrete. They call it partnership." He grinned faintly. "I call it divorce waiting to happen." He had not spoken her mother's name in months. 3 years had passed since fever carried her away, and the harbor had become the one rhythm left steady in their lives. He kept his rope coiled neat, his boots patched twice, his promises smaller, but truer. He still carried an old hanging scale in his locker, iron and stubborn, because his father once told him that a scale is a promise. It should not drift. Isla carried her notebook under her arm. In its pages, she had written equations in pencil. 1 kilogram equals 2.20462 pounds. 1 ton equals 1,000 kilograms. A 20-foot container weighed this much empty, that much full. A safety factor meant engineers admitted the world could surprise them. She liked the humility in that word, factor. It was an engineer's way of bowing to rust, to salt, to the stubbornness of wood and steel. They reached the lockers. Her father's door was blistered with rust. Inside lay rope, gloves, and the hanging scale. He lifted it with care, thumb brushing the worn dial. "Say good morning," he said. "Good morning," Isla whispered. The scale's spring still found its truth each time it was pulled. She watched it settle. Steel did not flatter. It told the weight it felt. "Your book," her father said, nodding to her notebook. "What do the numbers say today?" "They say the sun weighs what it weighs, even if no one looks," she answered. His laugh was quieter this time, touched with pride. The yard moved with its familiar rhythm. Men shouted short phrases in English and Spanish. Forklifts beeped. A gull screamed overhead and landed near a chip bag. Isla tucked herself by the forklift chargers, opened her notebook, and began her ritual. Date, tide height, first container seal number. She sketched the outline of a crane just for the joy of it. Then she lifted her eyes again to the glass wall above. On the screen upstairs, she read a slide title, Final Optimization Model. The subtitle caught in her throat. Throughput gains and risk-adjusted return. She swallowed. Her father saw her gaze and said gently, "Keep walking, Isla." "That word," she said, "optimization. It means the computer tells a story that makes someone rich. His voice was dry, but not bitter, just tired. Isla had read library books about optimization, choosing the best outcome under limits, the rules called constraints. Equations lined up like soldiers on a page, but the harbor was not neat. Salt chewed steel. Wind was never linear. A safety margin was honesty. The world had moods, and the world would punish arrogance. She remembered an article about NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter. One team had written numbers in pound force. Another expected newtons. A mismatch invisible on paper, but merciless in orbit. The craft dipped too low, shattered in silence. Not mystery, not fate, just units. She had read that line 3 times. One wrong conversion can undo empires. Now she stared at the bright 2.2 she thought she glimpsed in a column upstairs. 2.2. It could be anything, but in her head it hummed with recognition. 1 kilogram equals 2.20462 pounds. That number had its own music, and if it was miswritten, it could tilt everything. Her father joined his crew at berth C. The foreman waved, asked, "You bring the kid again, Luis?" "She brings herself," he said. "I am only the chauffeur." The men laughed and moved on. Isla listened. A woman in sharp glasses from the consultant team walked with a colleague, pointing to the concrete edge. "Load-bearing capacity modeled at factor 1.5, she said. "We can stretch to 1.3 if we sequence loads carefully." Her colleague nodded, eager. "And the optimization?" "Elegant," she replied. "Balanced return. Beautiful convexity." Convexity. Isla stored the word like a pebble in her pocket. Safety factor, live load, convexity. Words became tools. Later, as her father coiled rope, Isla asked quietly, "Papa, if your scale says one thing and a paper says another, which do you believe?" He looked at her, then at his scarred hands. "I believe the hand that will be crushed if the paper is wrong. But truth should survive being weighed twice, by paper and by steel." She nodded, but her eyes returned to the glass wall. The slide upstairs had changed again. Color bars, a line titled "Risk-Adjusted Return Climbing Politely Upward." Beneath, a footnote blinked. Units standardized across models. The rest was lost in glare, but her chest tightened. She wrote in her notebook, "Weigh the promise." The shift ended. Men left with their lunch tins empty, their backs bent but steady. Her father slung the scale on his shoulder. Together they walked out to the road where gulls wheeled and morning light burned away the sodium glow. Behind them, in that glass wall, the model was about to be called perfect. And Isla Martinez, 12 years old, carrying a notebook and her father's rusted scale, had already begun to see its flaw. The morning returned with mist rolling low over the harbor. Cranes rose like half-buried skeletons in fog, their arms vanishing into whiteness. Isla walked beside her father, her notebook hugged tight against her chest. The pencil in her pocket felt heavier than it was. It was her compass, her tool for naming things too large to hold in her hands. Her father hummed a tune from his youth. It was a work song, steady and plain, as if meant to keep rhythm with footsteps and rope pulls. Isla smiled faintly. The sound was comforting, like a lantern glowing in fog. Near the lower offices, a door stood ajar. A janitor's mop leaned against the wall. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed. Isla slowed her pace. Curiosity tugged at her like tide water. She slipped inside. The hallway smelled faintly of ink and detergent. Posters declared slogans: "Safety first," "Innovation in motion," "Partnership for tomorrow." She moved past them until she reached a small office. On its wall stretched a wide whiteboard crowded with formulas and arrows. The air smelled of marker ink. Isla stepped closer, her eyes drawn to a simple line written near the center. It compared pounds to kilograms. The numbers did not match what she knew. Her heart quickened. She had memorized that conversion long ago from a library book. 1,000 kilograms should weigh just over 2,200 pounds. But the board had written it differently, trimmed, rounded, bent. Small, perhaps, but not honest. And from that tiny tilt, equations stretched outward. Limits of piers, load plans for cranes, tables showing how containers would be stacked. It was like watching a single stone placed crooked at the base of a wall, then seeing an entire building rise upon it. At first, the flaw was invisible. In time, the wall would lean. Her throat tightened. She remembered the story of NASA's lost spacecraft. A mistake in units, pounds confused with newtons, had pulled the machine too close to Mars. It had vanished in a burst of silence. Not a mystery of the cosmos, not fate. Only a number written wrong. She whispered to herself, "If it can happen in space, it can happen here." The janitor entered, startled to see her. "Little one, you shouldn't be here." She nodded quickly and fled before anyone else noticed, but the numbers clung to her like damp air. Back on the dock, the harbor returned to its rhythm, the groan of steel, the gulls' shrill calls, men's voices carrying across the yard. Isla sat on her block near the forklift chargers and opened her notebook. Her pencil scratched across the page. She drew a simple outline of a container. Beside it, she wrote the weight it should carry when filled. Then she compared what the model would predict if it used the wrong unit. The difference was small for one container, a few dozen pounds. But she imagined hundreds of them stacked, then thousands moved each season. The error would not stay small. It would grow, invisible at first, until concrete bent or a bolt snapped. She chewed her pencil and wrote a line. "A truth ignored is still truth, but one day it will collect its debt." Her father came during his break, wiping sweat from his brow. He noticed her frown. "You look like a professor solving a puzzle," he teased. She showed him the sketch. "Papa, their numbers are wrong. Each container looks lighter than it really is. Only by a little. But multiplied, it will hurt the pier." Luis studied her page. He had never studied engineering, but he had lived with weight all his life. He had felt cables snap and beams bend. He had seen a man injured because a container shifted when the balance was off. He did not need equations to know what weight could do. He put his rough hand on her shoulder. "Maybe you are right, Mija. But upstairs, they do not listen to dockhands, and they do not listen to dockhands' children." Her jaw tightened. But truth is truth, even if no one listens. He sighed, the kind of sigh that carried more years than words. "Yes, but truth without power is like a gull's cry against the storm." She lowered her gaze to her notebook and wrote again. "Truth without power is still truth, but power without truth is collapse." Later that day, she overheard two men in polished boots near the fuel pumps. Their voices were hushed, but Isla had learned to listen for whispers. "Leave the conversion as it is," one said. "It makes the tables look cleaner." "Cleaner?" the other asked. "Investors don't care about decimals. They care about charts that rise. Let it stand." They walked away, satisfied. Isla felt her chest burn. This was not a mistake. It was chosen. A lie dressed in neat lines and polite colors. That evening at home, she opened her notebook under the weak light of a lamp. Her father's hanging scale lay on the table beside her. She filled a burlap bag with sand and hooked it onto the scale. The needle swung, then found its place. She wrote the true weight in her notebook. Then she compared it to what the flawed conversion would predict. The numbers were close, almost the same. Almost, but not. She stared at the scale. Rust flecked its face. But the spring still spoke with honesty. It could not flatter. It could not be persuaded. She whispered, "The scale is reality. The model is story. Which one should the city believe?" The answer echoed in her memory. A spacecraft, lost because men trusted the wrong unit. A harbor could be lost the same way. She closed her notebook. But the thought pulsed on, steady as the tide. She knew then that silence would not protect her city. She would have to speak. The evening settled heavy on the harbor. The last horn had sounded, and workers streamed out with their empty lunch tins. Shoulders stooped, but voices lightened by the thought of rest. Isla and her father walked home along the cracked sidewalk where grass grew through the cement. He carried the old hanging scale over his shoulder. It swayed with each step, its iron hook clinking softly like a bell. At home, their kitchen smelled of beans warming on the stove. The window rattled whenever a truck passed on the road outside. The house was small, 2 rooms, patched roof, but it held the warmth of her father's voice and the steady presence of objects that did not lie. A rope coil by the door, a hammer on the shelf, the scale on its hook. After supper, her father rubbed his eyes. "Mija, I will sleep early. Long shift tomorrow." He kissed her hair the way he always did, and went to the narrow bed. Isla remained at the table with her notebook. She placed the hanging scale in front of her, and looked at it the way another child might look at a candle flame. The metal was scarred with rust, but the spring inside still carried its memory of truth. Her mother had once told her that some objects keep the spirit of their makers. Isla believed that of the scale. She filled a burlap sack with handfuls of sand, tied it with rope, and hooked it onto the scale. The needle swung, then steadied. She wrote the result in her notebook, the neat script she had practiced since she was small. Then she compared. She wrote the model weight, the one the whiteboard had predicted with its trimmed conversion. The 2 numbers were close, but not the same. She circled the gap with her pencil. To another eye, it might look harmless. But she knew better. A small gap becomes a large one when multiplied. A wrong note repeated through a song becomes unbearable. She lifted the sack again, added another handful of sand, weighed it once more. The needle trembled, found its resting place. She wrote the truth. Again, the difference. Again, the circle around it. She whispered to herself as she worked, "Feasible only if the unit is true, false if the unit is flipped." The phrase felt like a spell, one she could not stop repeating. Her mind wandered back to the story of NASA's lost spacecraft. She had memorized the article nearly word for word. The engineers had not been careless fools. They were brilliant minds. Yet brilliance had not saved them from silence. A mismatch of units slipped into the heart of their equations, and the machine was lost in a single sweep of planetary gravity. If it could happen in space, with all of NASA's power and brilliance, how could this harbor be safe if men with suits chose to ignore the same danger? She pressed her pencil hard into the paper until the tip snapped. The sound startled her, sharp against the quiet. She sharpened it again, slower this time, letting the rhythm calm her. The next day, before school, Isla returned to her experiments. Her father's scale hung from a beam in the yard. She tied the burlap sack once more and filled it not with sand, but with small stones she collected from the roadside. She liked the way stones made the weight less uniform, more like the uneven cargo of a container. She measured, wrote, measured again. Each time the truth of the scale stood firm. Each time the model weight wandered away, small at first, then greater as she imagined stacking the numbers higher. She began to draw. Simple sketches of beams bending, of bolts stretched thin, of concrete slabs cracking hairline by hairline. Her drawings were crude, but they carried meaning. She could see the story unfolding on paper. A pier slowly losing strength, a crane carrying more than it should, a worker standing beneath. She swallowed hard and pushed the drawing aside. Instead, she wrote a sentence in the middle of the page. The danger of almost truth is that it wears the face of safety. At school, Isla carried her notebook in her backpack. During lessons, her eyes sometimes drifted back to her pages. Numbers, arrows, sketches. They were her hidden language. Other children wrote about fairy tales. She wrote about forces and trust. Her teacher noticed once and asked gently, "Isla, why are you always writing numbers?" She hesitated, then said, "Because numbers do not lie if you treat them with respect." The teacher smiled sadly, not fully understanding. But Isla did not mind. Some truths were too heavy to pass into other hands too soon. That evening, her father found her again at the table, scale beside her, notebook open. "You work harder than I do," he said, easing into the chair. "I'm trying to prove something," she whispered. "And what is that?" "That the harbor is in danger. That their model is wrong." He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "I believe you, Mija. But remember, belief and power are not the same. Men upstairs can choose not to see." She met his tired eyes. "But if no one weighs the promise, who will be safe?" He reached across the table and touched her notebook. "Then weigh it, Isla. But be ready for them to laugh. Truth is often laughed at before it is heard." She nodded slowly. She knew laughter could wound, but she also knew silence could kill. That night, after her father slept, she held the scale in her hands. The hook was cool, the face scratched, the spring old but faithful. She whispered to it as if it were a friend. "You and I will tell the truth, even if no one believes us." She wrote her final line of the day in the notebook. "Numbers can deceive. Steel cannot." As she closed the book, she felt something firm inside her chest. Not anger, not fear. Something steadier. Resolve. For the first time, she began to imagine standing in that bright room upstairs, placing her rusted scale on the polished table and daring the numbers to face reality. She did not yet know how she would do it, but the picture stayed with her long after she blew out the lamp. And outside, the harbor breathed its steady breath, waiting. The dawn was colorless when Luis Martinez rose for his shift. The house was still, save for the faint drip of a leaky tap and the faraway hum of trucks on the highway. He sat on the edge of his bed, boots heavy in his hands. His shoulders ached from years of pulling, hoisting, guiding. There was no medal for such aches, no certificate. Only the quiet knowledge that if he did not rise, the harbor would falter, if only a little. Isla stirred from her mat in the corner. She rubbed her eyes, her hair tangled into soft ropes. "Papa, you go already?" He smiled faintly. "The harbor never sleeps, Mija. Someone has to keep it breathing." She pushed herself up. "I'll walk with you." "No," he said gently. "School waits. You need rest." "But I rest when the world is sleeping," she said. Luis chuckled, shaking his head. "Stubborn like your mother." Then his voice softened. "All right. Walk with me a little." The streets leading to the harbor were lined with warehouses, their walls scarred with graffiti and years of storms. A dog barked at nothing. A man slept on cardboard near a loading bay. Luis carried his lunch tin, its paint chipped from decades of use. He had once thought of buying a new one, but the old tin was part of his ritual. It had held food through strikes, layoffs, floods, and funerals. To replace it would feel like erasing survival. "Papa," Isla asked quietly, "do you ever wish you worked upstairs, in those offices with glass walls?" He shrugged. "Work is work. Office men shuffle papers. We shuffle steel. One without the other, nothing moves. But they earn more. They do. And they decide more." "They do," he admitted. "But Mija, there are two kinds of power. The power to command and the power to endure. Endurance is quieter, but it lasts longer." Isla thought about that as gulls wheeled overhead. She had seen endurance in her father's back, bowed but unbroken. She had seen it in the calluses of the men who pulled ropes until their palms bled. Invisible power, hidden in plain sight. At the dock, the crew gathered around rusted barrels, sipping from paper cups of bitter coffee. Their faces were weathered, eyes lined from years of salt wind. They spoke in half English, half Spanish, sentences stitched together with laughter and curses. "Another big deal today," one man muttered. "Investors coming with their cameras." "Investors?" another spat. "They don't know a sling from a shackle. They only know suits." Luis sipped quietly, not adding to the noise. He had long ago learned that bitterness drained strength faster than work did. But he felt the truth of their words. Men like him were invisible until something broke. Isla sat near the forklift chargers, notebook in her lap. She sketched the men, bent shoulders, caps pulled low, hands always moving. To anyone else, they looked ordinary, almost faceless. But she saw the details. She saw how one man always checked his knot twice, how another hummed a tune to keep rhythm while he hauled. Invisible workers, each carrying a piece of the harbor on his back. Her father approached during a pause. He handed her the old scale, the hook cool against her palm. "Play with it," he said, though his eyes carried weight. She traced the etched numbers with her finger. "Why do you still keep it?" He looked out over the water. "Because when the world is noisy, the scale speaks simple. It says, this is the weight. No lies, no excuses." "Would they believe it upstairs?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "They believe what is convenient." Then he softened. "But for us, the scale is enough. It keeps us honest." She hugged it to her chest. To her, the scale was not just a tool. It was proof that truth existed outside of reports and contracts. That night at home, Isla watched her father wash his hands at the sink. The water turned gray, running over scars. "Papa," she said, "if they never listen, why do you keep working?" He dried his hands slowly. "Because leaving would not change the harbor. Staying keeps you fed. And maybe, just maybe, truth waits for someone to listen. Until then, we endure." His words sank deep into her chest. She understood endurance now, not as weakness, but as resistance. The invisible worker's world was a world of unspoken strength, of men who bent so that steel and ships could stand. Later, when the house was quiet, Isla opened her notebook. She drew her father's hands, scarred, broad, holding the scale. Beside the drawing, she wrote, "Invisible hands keep the harbor alive. Invisible voices hold its truth." She closed the book, knowing her father's world would not appear in newspapers or speeches, but in her pages it would endure. For Isla, the night was not just rest. It was a vow. She would not let the invisible remain unseen forever. The harbor was louder than usual that week. A new shipment had arrived from overseas, and the air buzzed with rumors of visiting investors. Trucks rumbled across the yard, horns blared, and the heavy rhythm of cranes swung above. To Isla, It all sounded like a drumbeat too quick, too insistent, as though the harbor itself knew something restless was coming. She stayed close to her father's side that morning, her notebook hidden under her jacket. He guided slings onto a load, steady and calm despite the rush around him. She admired how he never seemed hurried. "The harbor already has a heartbeat," he liked to say. "If you rush, you only trip over it." But upstairs, the heartbeat was different. The glass offices glowed bright even at midday, and the silhouettes of men and women in suits leaned close over their slides. Their movements looked rehearsed, like actors on a stage. During her father's break, Isla wandered toward the admin wing. She walked slowly, pretending to trace shapes in her notebook. The wind carried voices down from an open balcony above. She stopped beneath it, pressing her ear against the shadowed wall. "Leave the conversion alone," one voice said, firm and clipped. "It rounds cleaner. The investors don't want clutter." Another voice replied, lower. "But technically nothing. The public won't know the difference between pounds and kilograms. Keep it smooth. Keep it elegant." Isla's stomach tightened. She knew those words. Pounds and kilograms. The same mistake she had traced in her notebook. The same ghost that had haunted her thoughts since she saw the whiteboard. She had hoped it was just oversight, a careless slip. But here, in the cold tone of the voices, she heard something worse. Decision. She scribbled quickly in her notebook. Error chosen, not born. Convenience over truth. Later that afternoon, she followed her father to a fueling station where men gathered. 2 engineers in polished boots stood apart, their voices low. She drifted closer, pretending to sketch a crane. "The model gives us the return we need," one said. "Safety factors can stretch. Nobody inspects decimals." His colleague frowned. "What about liability? If something fails, that's years down the line. By then, the project is complete. The investors have their cut. The city pays the repairs. That's the beauty of it." The words struck her like cold water. Beauty, they had called it. A beauty that lived in numbers but ignored lives. Her pencil shook against the page as she wrote, "A lie drawn neat is still a lie." That evening, Isla and her father sat in their kitchen. He ate slowly, shoulders heavy from the shift. She placed her notebook before him, open to her hurried notes. "They know, Papa," she whispered. "They know the units are wrong, and they choose it. They think no one will notice." Luis studied the page. His brow furrowed, but his voice was calm. "Mija, listen. People with power see numbers like curtains. They draw them to cover the cracks. If the curtain looks smooth, they call it strong." "But the pier will pay," Isla said, her eyes wet. "The workers will pay. You will pay." He reached across the table and touched her hand. His palm was rough, but his grip steady. "We live in the world of consequences. They live in the world of appearance. Sometimes those worlds crash into each other, but not always right away." She lowered her head. "Then how do we stop it?" He sighed. "Truth is like water. It finds its way, but slowly. You must be patient." But Isla's chest burned. She had been patient. She had drawn, measured, weighed. Now she had overheard the whispers themselves, and the whispers confirmed what the numbers had already shouted. The harbor's safety was being traded for elegance on a slide. That night, sleep would not come. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling's water stains, listening to the distant groan of ships on the tide. Her father's breathing was steady in the next room. She turned to her notebook, opening to a fresh page. She drew a curtain across half the paper, then behind it, a sketch of a cracked pier. Above, she wrote, "Curtains can hide cracks, but not weight." She remembered the line from the NASA article. A spacecraft had been lost not because of a storm in space, but because numbers were left unchecked. Negligible, some had called the mismatch. But space had not forgiven. Neither would the sea. Her pencil moved again. One day, the harbor will weigh the lie for itself, and when it does, it will not be gentle. The following morning, Isla carried her father's hanging scale in her bag. She wanted its weight close to her. It felt like a talisman, proof that reality could not be bent by whispers in balconies. She watched the men in suits step out of cars with tinted windows. Their shoes clicked across the pavement, clean and glossy, untouched by salt or grease. They walked past dock hands without a glance. Invisible men to visible money. One of them laughed as he spoke into his phone. "Optimization is perfect. The model sings. Investors love numbers that sing." Isla gripped the strap of her bag tighter. In her notebook, she had written the opposite. "Truth is not a song to please ears. It is the weight of steel, the sound of cables under strain." Her father noticed her quiet intensity. "What are you thinking, mija?" he asked as they walked home. "That lies are louder than truth right now," she said softly. He nodded. "For now. But remember, lies carry no weight. One day the harbor will demand proof." She looked at the scale in her bag. She thought of the boardroom with its glass walls and glittering slides. She thought of the whispers she had overheard, the deliberate blindness. And she began to imagine something she had not before. Not only proving the truth in her notebook, but showing it to them. Showing them in a way that no chart could hide. Her resolve hardened with the tide. She would not remain a silent listener to whispers. She would find her moment to speak, and when she did, she would not whisper. The glass tower that overlooked the harbor always seemed to Isla like another world. From below, the windows reflected the sky, blinding in daylight and golden at sunset. Dock hands walked past it with shoulders bent, rarely looking up. For them, the building might as well have been a mountain, too tall, too far, too cold. But that morning, Isla's heart hammered as she stepped through its polished doors beside her father. She had begged him all night. He had resisted, shaken his head, told her there was no place for a child in boardrooms where millions were traded like cards. But in the end, he had seen the fire in her eyes. And perhaps, deep inside, he carried his own quiet hope that truth deserved at least one chance to speak. The receptionist glanced up at them with raised brows. Luis looked weary, but unbent. "We request to speak with the technical team," he said. The woman's lips pressed thin. "The board is in session." Isla hugged her notebook tighter. "Please, just for a moment." Something in her voice, earnest, trembling yet clear, made the woman hesitate. At last, she gestured them toward a side hall. "Wait here. No promises." Minutes later, a man in a dark suit arrived. His smile was sharp. "Dock staff?" he asked. Luis nodded. "My daughter has seen something." "Your daughter?" the man interrupted, incredulous. His eyes fell to Isla's small frame, the braid down her back, the worn shoes. "You brought a child to a board session?" "She has numbers," Luis said simply. The man exhaled in exasperation. "Follow me, briefly." The boardroom was a stage of glass and light. At the long table sat investors in tailored suits, consultants with hard hats too clean to be real, and city officials who shifted papers like shields. A projector hummed softly, displaying slides of graphs that all leaned upward, neat and confident. When Isla entered, the room stirred. A few chuckled. One woman in pearls frowned as though offended by the intrusion. Luis stood tall behind his daughter, silent but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man in the dark suit said dryly, "this is a dockhand's daughter. She insists she has something urgent to say about our model." The words landed like a slap, and laughter rippled through the room. Isla's face flushed, but she stepped forward. She placed her notebook on the polished table, her hands trembling. "The units are wrong," she said, voice breaking but audible. "Your model uses the wrong conversion between pounds and kilograms. It makes every container seem lighter than it really is. That means the pier will hold less than you think. It will break." Silence fell for a moment. Then a man at the far end barked a laugh. "Child, do you even know what mixed integer optimization is?" More laughter followed. Isla gripped her pencil like an anchor. "I know that if your foundation is wrong, no equation can save it. I know steel does not forgive decimals. I know one wrong unit destroyed a spacecraft, and it will destroy this harbor too if you let it." That silenced a few chuckles. One engineer at the side of the room straightened. He leaned toward his colleague and whispered, almost involuntarily, "This sounds like NASA in '99. But before he could continue, a consultant cut him off. "Enough. We are not here for fairy tales. Thank you, child, but this is not a classroom." A city official cleared his throat. "We appreciate your passion, but the technical review has been certified. This is no place for playground experiments." The laughter resumed, softer now, but sharp as glass. Isla felt her cheeks burn. She looked at her father. His face was carved with restraint, anger hidden beneath years of endurance. She closed her notebook slowly, as if each page weighed a stone. "I only wanted you to weigh the promise," she whispered. Her voice was almost drowned by the shuffle of papers, the clicking of pens. No one answered. When they stepped outside, the sunlight felt cruel. Isla held the notebook to her chest, her tears hot. "They laughed at me," she said. Her father's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "Yes, they laughed. They laughed because truth is small today, and they believe they are large. But listen to me, mija. Laughter is not the same as proof." She shook her head. "I showed them. They didn't care." "Not yet," he said. His voice was steady. "Sometimes people must hear truth twice, 3 times before they can no longer pretend it is silence." She walked beside him, anger and sorrow tangled in her chest. "Then I'll show them again. I'll show them with steel, with your scale." Luis looked down at her, his heart aching with both pride and fear. He knew what such a vow could cost, but he also knew that the harbor had placed something rare in his daughter's hands, a sense of responsibility larger than her years. That evening, Isla sat at the kitchen table again, the scale beside her. She turned its hook slowly, the metal catching the lamplight. "They think I'm just a child," she murmured. The scale did not answer. But when she hooked the burlap bag of sand once more, its needle swung faithfully to the truth. And that truth, quiet but unshaken, gave her the courage to whisper back, "Then I will make them listen." The harbor was a different creature at night. By day it roared, all metal and shouts and diesel. By night it whispered, its cranes still but watchful, their silhouettes black against the faint glow of the city beyond. The tide lapped slow against the pylons. Lamps threw small circles of yellow on the ground, leaving deep shadows in between. Isla walked softly across the concrete, her father's scale tucked under her arm and her notebook in her bag. The air smelled of salt and rust. Every sound was amplified, the creak of a rope in the wind, the clink of her shoe on a loose stone. She pulled her jacket tighter, her heart racing, but she kept walking. She had not told her father. If she had, he would have stopped her. He would have said the harbor at midnight was no place for a child. He would have said truth was dangerous when powerful men wanted silence. But Isla knew that silence itself was dangerous too. At Berth C, the containers stood like a sleeping army, stacked in rows. Their painted names looked faded in the dim light. She stopped by one that had been left near the edge, waiting for dawn to bring a truck. Its steel sides were streaked with rust, its door sealed with a thin strip of metal. She set down the scale. The hook gleamed faintly. It was not built to weigh a full container, no human scale could, but it could weigh enough to prove a point. Isla opened her bag of stones and sand. She tied a smaller sack to the scale, testing the spring, feeling the tug. She scribbled in her notebook. Then she looked up at the hulking shape of the container. She could not weigh it directly, but she could weigh part of its load, measure, and compare. She climbed onto the lower rung of the container's ladder and knocked gently on the steel. The sound was deep, resonant. She imagined its weight pressing down into the pier, invisible but absolute. Then she imagined the wrong numbers written on the whiteboard upstairs, trimming that weight into something neater. "Not neat," she whispered. "False." She returned to the ground, her mind racing. She filled another sack with more stones, hooked it to the scale, and watched the needle swing. Again, she wrote the truth. Again, she compared it to what the flawed conversion would claim. The difference was clear, small but stubborn. And multiplied by a container's true mass, by rows of containers, by years of loads, it grew into a warning. She drew a quick sketch in her notebook. The pier bending, a bolt snapping. Beneath it she wrote, "The scale does not lie. The pier will not forgive." She did not hear her father until his shadow fell across her notebook. "Isla," he said softly. She spun, startled, the scale swinging in her hand. His face was stern, but beneath it was fear. "What are you doing here at this hour?" She hesitated, then lifted the scale as if it could defend her. "I had to prove it, Papa. Not just in numbers, in steel. If I can show them that the model fails against reality, they can't ignore it." Luis closed his eyes briefly, then knelt beside her. "Mija, listen to me. They will not thank you for truth. They will crush you for it. But if I stay silent, the harbor will pay. Workers will pay. You will pay." Her voice broke. "I cannot let that happen." He studied her face, the fire in her eyes too old for 12 years. His hands trembled as he touched her shoulder. "You remind me of your mother," he said quietly. "She also believed silence was a kind of sin." Tears burned in Isla's eyes. "Then help me, Papa. Help me show them." He looked at the scale, at the crude sacks of stone, at her notebook filled with drawings and scribbles. It seemed absurd, and yet, in that moment, he felt its gravity. The absurd had always been how truth began. At last he nodded. "One test, then we go home." Together they worked in the dim light. Luis lifted the sack, heavier than what Isla could manage, and hung it on the scale. She recorded the number carefully. Then they calculated the difference between reality and the model she had copied from the whiteboard. Her pencil flew. The margin of error grew larger with each example. Luis stared at the notebook. He did not understand every equation, but he understood the story it told. The story of weight ignored, of danger deferred, of lies dressed as neat charts. He felt his stomach tighten. "You're right," he whispered. "It is wrong." "Then we must show them," Isla said fiercely. He looked out at the sleeping containers, the cranes towering like dark guardians. "If we show them, they may laugh again. But one day, they will not laugh." "Then let that day be soon," she said. The tide shifted. and the harbor groaned as if in answer. A gull cried, lonely in the night. Isla closed her notebook, pressing the pencil hard inside. She lifted the scale once more, its rusted body heavy but faithful. "This will be our witness," she said softly. Her father placed his hand on hers, steadying it. "Then carry it carefully, mija, for steel may speak louder than paper." They left the pier together, the scale swinging gently between them, its hook catching the faint light of the lamps. Behind them, the harbor returned to silence. But in Isla's chest, the silence was broken. She had proof now, not just in numbers but in steel. And steel, unlike men in suits, could not be persuaded to lie. The morning of the signing broke bright and cold. Flags fluttered above the city hall where the boardroom had been prepared like a stage. Polished floors gleamed, cameras lined the walls, and rows of chairs faced the long mahogany table where pens of gold waited, their caps shining as though they already knew their part in history. The harbor's fate, $1.2 billion worth of steel, concrete, and promises, rested on the papers stacked neatly at the table's center. Investors in dark suits adjusted their ties. City officials rehearsed their smiles. Reporters whispered, their pens poised to capture history's weight. Isla stood outside with her father, the old hanging scale hidden beneath her jacket. Her hands trembled not from the cold, but from the enormity of what she carried. In her notebook were pages of scribbled numbers, sketches of beams bending, warnings written in a child's hand. But in her arms was something stronger, iron, spring, and truth. Her father's face was grave. "Mija, once you walk in, you cannot take it back. They will not forgive interruption." "They don't need to forgive," Isla whispered. "They need to listen." Inside, the room buzzed with expectation. A consultant tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we secure a future of prosperity. The optimization model before us proves the project's efficiency. Our harbor will shine as a beacon of modern engineering." Applause filled the room. The mayor leaned forward with his pen. The investors smiled, their eyes already counting returns. The doors opened. At first, no one noticed the small figure slipping inside, her braid brushing her jacket, her boots scuffed from dock dust. But when Isla walked to the front, her father close behind, the room stirred with confusion. Murmurs rippled across the table. "What is this?" a man demanded. Isla did not answer. She walked to the table, lifted the old scale from beneath her jacket, and set it down beside the shining pens. Its rusted frame looked out of place against the polished wood. The hook clinked against the surface. The room fell into uneasy silence. "This," Isla said, her voice trembling but clear, "is the truth. Numbers can lie. Steel cannot." A nervous laugh broke from one of the investors. "What is this nonsense?" She opened her notebook and placed it beside the scale. "Your model says the containers are lighter than they are. It trims weight with a wrong conversion. It makes the pier look stronger than it is. But the pier will not obey your lie. The steel will not forgive. The harbor will collapse if you sign." The mayor frowned. "Young lady, this is not—" She cut him off, her small voice ringing louder than she expected. "NASA once lost a spacecraft to this same mistake. Pounds instead of newtons. A whole machine burned because of numbers ignored. Do you want the same for this harbor?" The room shifted uneasily. Reporters leaned forward. A few engineers exchanged glances. Her father spoke for the first time. His voice was low but steady. "Listen to her. She is no ordinary child. She has weighed this harbor with her own hands." The chairman of the investors laughed, though it sounded forced. A child's scale against millions of dollars of certified modeling? Ridiculous. Isla lifted her bag and pulled out a small sack of stones tied with rope. She hooked it to the scale. The needle swung, then settled. She pointed. This is weight. Real, not rounded. I tested it again and again. The numbers upstairs say something different. They are neat, but they are false. Look for yourself. The scale stood still, its needle unbending. The boardroom's polished silence felt suddenly fragile. One engineer, gray-haired, leaned forward. His voice cracked. My God, this is the exact error that cost NASA $125 million in '99. The words dropped like stone into water. Murmurs rose. Reporters scribbled furiously. The investors shifted, unease creeping into their smiles. The chairman's hand trembled slightly as he gripped his pen. This is absurd. No, Isla said, her voice firm now. What is absurd is believing paper more than steel. What is absurd is risking lives for elegance in a chart. Her words hung in the air. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. The mayor cleared his throat, but the confidence was gone from his voice. We must ensure the city's safety. Perhaps a review. Review? One investor hissed. If this error is true, liability could be catastrophic. Billions in damages. We cannot sign under doubt. The polished rhythm of the meeting collapsed. Papers shuffled, whispers rose, faces turned pale. What had moments before been celebration now unraveled into panic. Isla stood silent, her hand resting on the rusted scale. The hook gleamed faintly in the lights. Her father touched her shoulder gently. Mija, he whispered, you did it. But Isla's eyes stayed fixed on the table where the pens lay untouched. For the first time she saw fear in the eyes of those who had once laughed, and she knew that truth had finally been heard. The harbor had been given its witness. That night, when they walked home through the quiet streets, the scale heavy in her arms, Isla whispered, Numbers can be bent, but steel does not bend for lies. Her father squeezed her hand. And today, you made them weigh the promise. The city lights flickered in the distance. The tide rolled in, steady as breath. And Isla, though exhausted, felt a calm resolve settle over her. The battle was not finished, but the curtain had been torn. The lie had been seen. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. For a moment after Isla set the scale on the polished boardroom table, time seemed to pause. The golden pens glimmered, the contracts waited. And yet the weight of the room had shifted. No chart, no slide, no speech could erase the sound of the iron hook clinking against wood. The chairman forced a laugh. This is a farce. We are not here to be lectured by a child with a toy. But no one joined him. The engineers sat stiff, their eyes locked on the rusted scale. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching faster. The mayor looked uneasy, his fingers drumming the arm of his chair. Isla opened her notebook. Her small hands trembled, but her voice was steady. This is no toy. This scale belonged to my grandfather. My father used it every day, and last night I used it to test what your model refuses to admit. She pulled out the small burlap sack of stones, tied with dock rope, and hooked it onto the scale. The spring stretched, the needle swung, then settled. The faint tick of metal against metal echoed in the silence. This is weight, Isla said. Not neat, not rounded. Weight as the harbor knows it. When I compare it with your numbers, the truth is clear. Your containers are heavier than your model pretends. The pier will carry more than it can bear, and steel will not forgive. The room stirred. One engineer, a man with tired eyes and silver at his temples, leaned forward. She's right. The conversion on the slides, It trims the load, by just enough to make the optimization look clean. My God, this is exactly what doomed the Mars Climate Orbiter. Whispers rose. Reporters exchanged glances. The word NASA spread through the room like fire. "This is madness," snapped the chairman, his voice cracking now. "A dockhand's daughter cannot possibly—" But another voice cut in. A woman in a gray suit, a technical advisor, spoke with quiet force. "I've reviewed the model. She's right. The conversion factor is wrong. Deliberately wrong. It hides thousands of pounds across the system." The silence after her words was heavier than any weight Isla had measured. The mayor swallowed. If this is true, signing today would expose the city to catastrophic risk. If the pier fails— He broke off, staring at the scale as if it were an executioner's gavel. The investors erupted in whispers, their earlier confidence crumbling. "Liability," one hissed. "We'd lose everything." The chairman slammed his hand on the table. "This is sabotage." "No," Isla said softly. Her voice was small, but in the quiet it carried. "This is truth, and truth is heavier than sabotage." For a long moment no one spoke. Then the mayor set down his pen. The golden nib touched no paper. "This deal cannot be signed," he said. "Not until an independent audit is complete. We will not risk the harbor. Not after this." The words broke the spell. Cameras clicked. Reporters surged forward. Investors pushed back their chairs, pale with fury. Consultants gathered their papers with trembling hands. The grand performance of certainty had collapsed under the weight of a rusted scale. Luis stepped forward and placed his hand on Isla's shoulder. His eyes, dark with both pride and fear, met hers. "Mija, they have heard you." She looked down at the scale, its hook still swaying gently, the needle steady at truth. For the first time, she felt the laughter from days before dissolve. They could mock her words, her age, her shoes, but they could not mock steel. Steel had spoken. In the corner, the engineer with silver hair rose. His voice was heavy with memory. "I was at NASA in '99, he said quietly. "I watched men weep as the orbiter vanished because 2 teams refused to check a unit. We swore we would never let such arrogance cost lives again, and yet here we are." His words cut deeper than any slide. The investors lowered their eyes. The consultants shuffled. The truth was no longer Isla's alone. The meeting dissolved in chaos. Contracts were gathered, pens capped. The grand promise of signatures and celebrations drained away, leaving only unease and the weight of questions. Reporters pressed forward, shouting, "Dockhand's daughter exposes billion-dollar error. From NASA to our harbor, same mistake, same risk." But Isla barely heard them. She stood with her father, the scale clutched in her hands, the iron cool and solid. She felt exhaustion wash over her, but beneath it, a strange peace. She had done what she came to do. As they stepped outside, the air smelled of sea and diesel. The city hall behind them buzzed with uproar, but the harbor in the distance breathed steady, unchanged. Her father's voice was low. "They will fight this, Mija. They will try to bury it. But today, they could not bury you." She hugged the scale tighter. Because the scale doesn't care who listens, it only tells the truth. Luis nodded. "And today, you weighed their promise and found it light." They walked on, the old scale swinging gently in her hands. Behind them, the lie had been exposed. Ahead of them, the tide waited, patient as always. And in Isla's heart, a truth had settled firm. Empires may laugh at children, but they cannot laugh at steel. The days after the boardroom erupted, were unlike any the harbor had seen. Reporters swarmed the docks, their cameras clicking at rusted cranes and tired men who suddenly found themselves cast as unwilling symbols of a city's conscience. Headlines filled the newspapers. Dockhand's daughter halts 1.2B port deal. From NASA to our harbor, the same mistake, saved by a child. Isla read the words with disbelief. She was no hero in her own eyes, only a girl with a notebook and her father's scale. Yet the world seemed to have turned its gaze upon her. Her father received nods from men who once kept their heads down. "Your girl," one said, clapping him on the shoulder. "She gave us a voice." Luis only smiled faintly, though pride flickered in his tired eyes. "She gave the truth a voice," he corrected. The city moved quickly. Fear does what hope cannot. Within a week, the mayor announced a new regulation. Every infrastructure project exceeding $100 million would require an independent audit of all calculations, including unit verification and at least one physical test before approval. The law was nicknamed the Martinez Rule. Some praised it as progress. Others muttered about delays and costs. But no one could deny the need after the images of Isla's rusted scale had spread across front pages nationwide. The photograph of a small girl standing at a long, polished table, hand on a battered piece of iron, had become an emblem of honesty too stubborn to be ignored. For Isla, the days blurred. She still went to school, though her classmates now whispered her name in awe. Teachers smiled at her as though she carried secrets beyond her age. But at home, life was as it had always been. Beans simmering on the stove, her father's boots drying by the door, the steady hum of the harbor through their window. The scale hung in its old place, rust catching the light. Each time she passed it, she touched it lightly, as if to thank it for speaking louder than she ever could. One evening, her father asked, "What will you do now, mija? You've shaken the city." She looked at her notebook, pages filled with equations, sketches, truths scribbled in pencil. "I want to teach," she said softly. "Not in boardrooms. Here, for children like me. For the ones who think numbers are only for men in suits." Louise studied her, then nodded. "Your mother would be proud. She always said the smallest classrooms hold the biggest truths." Months later, after the noise of headlines had faded and the investors had retreated, Isla and her father traveled back to his childhood village inland. It was a place of dry fields and weathered barns, where most children rose early to help with chores and rarely saw the inside of a library. In a room above the old cooperative store, with walls patched by her father's hands, Isla began her school. She had only a chalkboard, a few worn books, and her notebook. But she also had the scale, hung at the front like a relic. On the first day, 5 children came. They sat shyly on benches, their hands rough from farm work. Isla lifted the scale for them to see. "This," she said, "is a promise. It tells the truth, even when the truth is heavy. And numbers are the same. They are not just for men in offices. They are for you, for us, to build, to protect, to endure." The children leaned forward, eyes wide. She showed them how weight pulls on a spring, how numbers can measure what the eye cannot see. She told them the story of a harbor, of a mistake too small for some to notice, and of how the smallest voice can still be heard if it is true. She ended with a phrase she had written many times. "Numbers can deceive. Steel cannot." Years would pass, and more children would come. Some would leave the village to study engineering, architecture, medicine. Others would stay, using their sharpened eyes to keep fields and bridges honest. All of them would remember the girl who taught them with a rusted scale and a notebook filled with stubborn truth. Luis grew older, his shoulders bending further, but his pride in his daughter grew stronger than any ache. He often sat in the back of the classroom listening quietly as she taught, his hands folded like a man at prayer. On the 10th anniversary of the Martinez rule, the city invited Isla back to the harbor for a ceremony. She stood once again before the glass tower, taller now, her braid longer, her eyes steady. Reporters asked her what she remembered most of that day when she had stopped a billion-dollar deal. She smiled softly. Not the headlines, not the cameras. I remember my father's scale, heavy in my hands, and I remember the silence that came after laughter, when truth finally spoke louder than money. The crowd applauded, but Isla only thought of her students waiting back in the village. That evening, she sat with her father on the pier, the same one where she had once drawn beams bending in her notebook. The tide rolled in, steady as breath. The cranes groaned in the distance. Luis placed his weathered hand over hers. "Mija," he said, "empires fall for many reasons, but they also rise again when people like you keep promises weighed." She leaned against him, the harbor lights reflecting in her eyes. "Then let's keep weighing them, Papa. One truth at a time." The old hanging scale rested beside them, silent but unbroken. And as the night settled over the harbor, the world felt, for once, perfectly balanced. Thank you, dear audience, for sharing your time and heart with this story. May it remind us that even the smallest voice, when it speaks the truth, can carry the weight of an empire.